I think I might hold the world record for the most insane HOA story ever told. Seriously, I do. It started, as all truly unbelievable things do, with a smell, a thick, acrid cloud that was less wood smoke and more chemical hate. It was 3:45 a.m., and that smell dragged me out of a dead sleep, pulling me up into the silent, cold dread that only comes when you realize something fundamentally wrong is happening right outside your window. I'm telling you, you won't believe what happened next. And trust me, I'm the quiet guy up the hill. I think I might hold the world record for the most insane HOA story ever told. Seriously, drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from, because this is going to be a wild ride. It was my oak tree, you see. Not just any tree, but a 150-year-old live oak, a family heirloom that stood sentinel over the corner of my property, a giant with a canopy wide enough to swallow a small car. It had been in my family for 3 generations, and someone, in the dead of night, had deliberately set it on fire. I ran out onto the lawn in a pair of mismatched socks, the flashing red and blue lights painting stripes across the suburban street, a surreal, sickly light washing over the immaculate beige and stone facades of the neighborhood. The trunk was still smoldering, the magnificent bark blistered and blackened, reduced to a pillar of charcoal. The fire department put it out fast, but the damage was done. It was gone. The smell of accelerant was unmistakable, a cheap chemical signature that screamed malice. This wasn't some random spark. This was calculated. This was an attack. The moment the fire marshal told me it was arson, my eyes went straight to one place: the corner house, the one with the meticulously manicured rose bushes and the surveillance cameras pointed squarely at my mailbox. That house belonged to Rhonda, the president of the Heritage Oaks Homeowners Association, the self-appointed Queen of Beige. She was the antagonist in this little suburban drama, the entitled bully who had spent the last 6 months sending me increasingly aggressive certified letters demanding I trim the very tree that now stood, tragically, ruined. It obstructs the line of sight for the Welcome to Heritage Oaks' monument. She had written, her tone dripping with the self-importance of someone who mistakes a local volunteer position for a judgeship. She wanted it gone, and now it was. I stood there, watching the smoke curl into the pre-dawn sky, and a cold, slow clarity settled over me. Rhonda had just made the biggest mistake of her smug, overconfident life. She thought she was messing with the quiet guy up the hill, the one who just pays his dues and keeps his head down. She didn't realize she had just declared suburban warfare on a forensic accountant who also happens to hold a JD. The game had changed. The initial shock gave way to a cold, methodical anger, the kind that doesn't scream or rage, but simply calculates. This wasn't over. This was just the inciting incident. If the destruction of the oak was the inciting incident, then Rhonda Albright was the flaming match thrown onto the dry kindling of suburban passive aggression. You need to understand who she was to appreciate the symmetry of her eventual downfall. Rhonda was the HOA president, but she carried herself with the air of a minor, unelected dictator. Her title, to her, was a license to enforce not just the bylaws, but her own personal, deeply restrictive aesthetic preferences. She was the quintessential Karen, but with a budget and the force of a poorly written contract. She was immaculate in her presentation, sharp, expensive, and perpetually disappointed in everyone else's life choices. Her clothes were always pressed, her blonde hair was perfectly shellacked, and her gaze was a cold forensic sweep that judged the quality of your front door paint. Everything about her screamed entitlement. Her history in Heritage Oaks was a long, petty trail of paper cuts. She had successfully engineered the removal of the Johnson family's blue mailbox. It wasn't in the approved color palette, she claimed. She filed an official complaint because old Mr. Henderson, the wise, retired professor down the street, put up solar panels that she insisted were a visual blight. She weaponized the HOA's reserves, using thousands of dollars to commission a study on the optimal shade of beige for all future fence replacements. She was a master of bureaucratic terror, using 3-page, single-spaced, certified letters as her primary tool of oppression. And I, the quiet guy up the hill, had become her newest and most satisfying target. Her campaign against my oak tree had been relentless, 1,000 paper cuts applied over 6 months. It started with a beige envelope tucked into my mailbox. Always a beige envelope, a subtle passive-aggressive signal of administrative displeasure. The letters escalated quickly. The tree root structure is non-compliant with the new sidewalk pouring standards. The canopy constitutes an unapproved obstruction of view for the common area. The sheer arrogance of it was breathtaking. The tree had been there long before her subdivision, long before the HOA was even a twinkle in a developer's eye. It was healthy, it was historically significant, and it was perfectly placed. But that didn't matter to Rhonda. She didn't want compliance. She wanted dominance. I remember the last conversation we had, just 3 days before the fire. I was getting my mail, and she was outside, pruning a rose with surgical precision. She approached me, her smile thin and condescending. "Mr. Vance?" she said, using my last name with that specific, arrogant emphasis only a true antagonist can master. "I hope you are considering the revised tree removal proposal. We've gone to a great deal of trouble for this. It's time for that unruly thing to go." She stood a little too close, smelling of expensive perfume and freshly clipped rose stems. I simply looked at her, calm and factual. "Rhonda," I told her, my voice quiet, "that tree has seniority over your entire subdivision. I'm not touching it." The look on her face was pure, smug overconfidence. She thought she had already won. She genuinely believed her entitlement was an impenetrable shield. But she was wrong. She had just laid the groundwork for her own undoing, and she had no idea that her petty obsession was about to be met with the precise, cold fury of a man who makes a living unraveling financial crimes. She had started a fire, and I was about to show her what a digital ghost could do with the ashes. The burning of the oak was the grand finale of Rhonda's campaign, but the opening acts had been playing out for months in a symphony of bureaucratic torment. She initiated the conflict with the first salvo, not a shout or a dramatic gesture, but an insidious, passive-aggressive blizzard of certified mail, always a beige envelope, always single-spaced, always citing a subsection of a bylaw that seemed to have been written specifically to allow her to justify her personal vendettas. Her letters weren't requests, they were declarations of war. My initial response was exactly what you'd expect from a methodical professional. I didn't get emotional. I didn't shout. I deployed facts. I was calm. I was factual. And I met her entitlement with the cool, impenetrable shield of the truth. I hired a certified arborist, a wise older figure named Dr. Elms, who had studied these trees for 50 years. He provided a detailed 3-page report declaring the oak tree to be in perfect health, historically significant, and, crucially, not in violation of any established setback rule. I even included a highlighted copy of the original 1968 deed restriction that grandfathered in all existing mature trees. My response was a complete, legal, and logical dismantling of her entire argument. It was a flawless piece of work. Rhonda's reaction was exactly what confirmed her status as the archetypal antagonist. She ignored all of it. At the next HOA board meeting, a grim, fluorescent-lit gathering that felt less like a democratic process and more like a star chamber, she addressed me directly, her voice pitched high with condescending concern. "Mr. Vance," she drawled, using that same arrogant emphasis on my surname, "while we appreciate your attempts to educate us, this isn't a university lecture. It's about community standards." She had dismissed $1,500 worth of professional certified data with a wave of her hand and a rhetorical flourish. She didn't want the truth. She wanted her version of the truth. I tried one final peaceful resolution. I calmly pointed out that the HOA had no standing to demand the removal of a healthy, protected tree based on an aesthetic objection. Section 4(b)(2) clearly states that. I said, holding up the handbook, "and your entire board is liable for any wrongful action." That's when her mask slipped. She leaned forward, her eyes narrow. "You know, Mr. Vance," she hissed, abandoning all pretext of civility, "maybe if you spent less time poring over dusty old books and more time on the community side of things, we wouldn't have these issues." A personal attack. She didn't have an argument, so she attacked the arguer. She was smug, overconfident, and utterly convinced that her petty authority trumped the law. In that moment, watching her sit there, basking in the glow of her small, entitled power, I knew the time for diplomacy was over. The oak was gone, and now my methodical planning phase had officially begun. She had forced my hand, and she was about to find out that a forensic accountant doesn't just look at balance sheets, they look at everything. The neighbors, including Rhonda Albright, saw me as the quiet guy up the hill. I paid my dues, kept my lawn tidy, and waved politely. I was the one who never attended the block parties or got involved in the neighborhood drama. To Rhonda, I was just a mild-mannered distraction, a boring obstacle that her superior force of personality could easily sweep aside. She thought she was battling a gardener. She was actually going head-to-head with a forensic accountant whose professional specialty was unraveling corporate fraud schemes that took multinational firms years to detect. This, the ability to be completely and utterly underestimated, was my greatest asset. My professional life wasn't about shouting or grand gestures. It was about the meticulous, patient assembly of devastating truth. I spent my days knee-deep in financial statements, tracing the path of money through shell companies and complex offshore accounts. My job was to find the one single-wire transfer slip, the one tiny inconsistency in the digital ledger that would bring down an entire criminal enterprise. It demands a specific kind of mind, analytical, precise, and capable of holding 1,000 seemingly irrelevant data points until they spontaneously click into a clear, damning pattern. That is my superpower. I am a man of method. When the fire marshal confirmed the arson, the professional switch flipped inside my head. The raw, emotional shock of losing the oak tree hardened into a cold, clinical determination. Rhonda had attacked my property, my family history, and my peace. She had used her petty authority to commit a crime. My response wasn't going to be a childish yell or a confrontation in the street. It was going to be a professional audit. I was going to treat her as I would treat a massive, fraudulent corporation, by mapping her vulnerabilities, understanding her operational history, and systematically dismantling her entire structure of influence. She saw my calm demeanor as weakness. She mistook my patience for apathy. She quoted bylaws at me, while I was already mentally cross-referencing her property tax records against the HOA's financial disclosures, looking for the inevitable, small thread that would lead to the tapestry of her downfall. The beige envelope of the HOA was about to meet the relentless scrutiny of someone who speaks the language of fraud. Rhonda had used fire to make a statement. I was going to use data to erase her entire existence from the neighborhood's power structure. She was smug and emotional. I was precise and patient. She had no idea how much trouble she was truly in. The planning had begun. The fire marshal called it arson, but his report was just the official footnote. I didn't need a bureaucrat in a uniform to confirm what my gut already knew. When I walked back out to the charred remnants of the oak tree the next morning, the scene was no longer about grief. It was about evidence. For a forensic accountant, the devil isn't in the flames, it's in the inconsistencies, and I was there to conduct a professional audit of the crime scene. The first thing I noticed was the placement. The oak was burned only at the base, an intense, targeted destruction of the root crown. A natural fire, even one started by lightning, spreads and flares unpredictably. This had been focused, surgical. It had been applied with intent. I knelt down, ignoring the still damp smell of foam and residual smoke, and noticed the ground. The crew had hosed everything down, but the heavy clay soil still held a faint, unnatural sheen. Rhonda's letters had accused me of letting the area get untidy, but now the ground around the tree was too clean, almost swept except for a few scattered patches of residue that weren't charcoal. They looked like minute fragments of plastic melted into the clay. They were hard, colorless, and utterly out of place. I carefully collected a sample, placing the tiny, brittle fragments into a sandwich bag I grabbed from my kitchen, the start of my official evidence ledger. The other major piece of the puzzle was the direction of the burn. The charring was most intense on the side of the trunk facing away from the street, shielded from any casual view or passing car. This wasn't some sloppy, drunken mistake. This was someone who came prepared, used a specific tool, and positioned themselves to avoid detection. It screamed of methodical planning. Rhonda Albright, the woman who had spent 6 months demanding my tree be removed, lived less than 50 yards away. She was the one who complained about a stray leaf on the sidewalk. She was the one who monitored everything. Was it really a coincidence that the fire occurred precisely where her sightline, as she claimed, was obstructed? I didn't believe in coincidences. I believed in patterns, motive, and opportunity. I walked back up to my quiet house on the hill, holding the small bag of melted plastic. The police would eventually close the case as undetermined, likely vagrancy, because that's what happens when you're the quiet guy up the hill and the antagonist is the beloved, albeit annoying, HOA president. But I knew the truth. My beautiful ancient tree was gone, reduced to a blackened stump by someone who thought their petty entitlement trumped everything. Now, she was dealing with a different entity entirely. She had given me the smoking gun, literally, and I was about to use my professional skills to trace that plastic residue, that fire, right back to her immaculate front door. She had started a fire. I was about to ignite a forensic investigation that would burn her entire world down. The first step was already complete. I had the evidence, and I had the focus. Next came the digital ghost hunt. Of all the arrogant, entitled things Rhonda Albright ever said, the one that truly drove the steel rod of resolve through my initial shock was the time she called the 150-year-old live oak an eyesore. That single word, delivered with a kind of condescending pity usually reserved for explaining basic arithmetic to a toddler, was the moment my righteous anger was forged into something cold and useful. It happened at the summer community picnic, a forced fun event where neighbors were expected to mingle while she performed her routine of petty dominance. She approached me while I was quietly observing the barbecue, a plastic cup of lukewarm lemonade in her hand. She wore a tailored linen sundress and a smug, proprietary expression. "Mr. Vance," she began, the word "Mr." sounding like an accusation, "we need to talk about that tree of yours." I've put it on the agenda for the emergency vote. I maintained my quiet authority, a calm center in her emotional storm. "Rhonda, as I've shown you, the tree is grandfathered in. It's part of the original property deed." She just sighed, a theatrical expulsion of air that was meant to signal her exhaustion with my factual obstinance. "Oh, the deed, Mr. Vance, we're a modern community. We have standards." Frankly, and here she leaned in, dropping her voice just enough to ensure the two neighbors nearby could still hear her, "that massive, sprawling thing is an eyesore. It lowers the aesthetic appeal of the common area. It needs to go. An eyesore." She was talking about a magnificent, irreplaceable piece of local history, a living organism that had witnessed 3 generations of my family, as if it were a faded garden gnome or an unapproved satellite dish. Her arrogance was breathtaking. She saw the natural world as something to be managed, pruned, and ultimately eradicated if it didn't fit her pre-approved beige vision of suburban perfection. She was so overconfident in her power that she didn't even bother with a flimsy legal justification. She just invoked her personal aesthetic preference and presented it as law. "I will have it removed, Mr. Vance," she stated, her jaw set with a venomous entitlement. One way or another. It was a vow, a direct threat delivered in a crisp, conversational tone. And she delivered on that promise, didn't she? Not through the bylaws, not through the legal process, but through arson. Standing there in the shadow of the smoke-blackened stump, the memory of her superior, entitled face saying, "It's an eyesore," brought a fierce clarity to my investigation. She had thought she was intimidating a simple neighbor. She had, in fact, given a forensic accountant a motive for professional retribution. She had used 1,000 paper cuts and finally, fire, to win a petty conflict. I was about to use my expertise, my patience, and my ability to follow the digital ghost of her financial life to ensure she lost everything. That entitlement, that smug, overconfident declaration, was now going to be her undoing. The planning was complete. It was time for execution. Losing the tree to arson was a declaration of war, but I was not about to rush into a screaming match in the street. Rhonda Albright wanted emotion. I was going to give her math. But even a forensic accountant needs a sounding board, a wise figure who can provide the necessary perspective. For me, that was Arthur Blackwood, a retired corporate lawyer who now spent his days fly fishing and occasionally offering profoundly cynical wisdom to those smart enough to seek it. I found him at his favorite local haunt, a diner with bad coffee and excellent anonymity. I laid out the facts simply, calmly. The arson, Rhonda's 6-month campaign, her supreme, overconfident entitlement. I finished with the simple declarative sentence, "She has to pay." Arthur, a man of profound patience and observation, didn't look up from stirring his coffee. He was an older figure, his face a road map of hard-won legal battles. He was a reluctant ally, but a necessary one. "You're an auditor, aren't you, Vance?" He finally said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "You don't seek revenge, you seek discrepancy." He finally met my eye, and his gaze was sharp and knowing. "She wants you to come at her with a hatchet. She's waiting for the drama, the neighborhood gossip. She'll use the HOA bylaws to claim defamation and play the victim. You give her that, and you lose." I waited, understanding I was being given crucial advice. "No," he continued, taking a slow sip. "You don't swing a hatchet. You find the single loose thread. You pull it, and you keep pulling until her whole sweater unravels. The small things, Vance. The 1,000 paper cuts." He leaned closer, and the rhetorical question hung in the air between us. "What's the one thing Rhonda Albright values more than her perfect lawn, more than her title, more than anything else in the world?" The question hung in the air. "Her image of perfection," I replied. "Her control." "Precisely," Arthur nodded, a slow, profound agreement. "Control is fragile. Power is usually built on a lie. You're a professional. Don't look at the tree. Look at the structure. Find the leverage point, the one thing she's convinced nobody will ever notice, and you use your professional expertise to exploit it." He finished his coffee and gave me a final knowing look. "Patience, Vance. The long game is the only game worth playing against an amateur bully. Start your audit. And when you strike, strike where it hurts the most." His words, cryptic but profound, crystallized the strategy. I wasn't going to seek justice through the police. I was going to seek justice through the ledger. Rhonda had used her petty authority as a weapon. I was going to use my formidable professional skills as a Chekhov's gun. The seed of the plan had been planted. I left the diner, the smell of bad coffee replaced by the clarity of cold, methodical resolve. I knew exactly where to begin my audit. The one place a proud, entitled HOA president would never expect the quiet guy up the hill to look the HOA's own books. The digital ghost hunt for her fiscal Achilles heel had officially begun. Rhonda Albright thought her power lay in the physical world, in the immaculate beige of her house, in the intimidating volume of her certified letters, and in the charred remains of my oak. She was wrong. Her real vulnerability, the Achilles heel of her entitlement, lay in the digital world she foolishly thought she controlled. As a forensic accountant, I don't deal in gossip or accusations. I deal in data, and every move she had made, every petty decision, had left a digital footprint I was now determined to trace. My investigation began not with a magnifying glass, but with a keyboard. I established my command center in my quiet home office, and the planning phase transitioned into execution with the silent, methodical click of a mouse. First, I targeted the public records. I downloaded every single HOA meeting minute going back 5 years. These were the transcripts of her rule, a written history of her petty power plays. I didn't just read them, I imported them into a text analysis program, looking for patterns, who always voted with her, who she targeted most frequently, and most importantly, any discussion regarding the use of HOA funds for legal consultation against specific properties, particularly mine. Next came the financials. I accessed the publicly available HOA tax filings and annual disclosures, cross-referencing every single invoice and expense report. Rhonda was meticulous about her lawn, but often, the most outwardly controlling people are the sloppiest when they think no one is looking at the details. I was hunting for the small, almost invisible anomalies. A vendor paid slightly too much, an expense filed under a general category that should have been specific, the faint scent of self-dealing. I was looking for the digital ghost of a bribe or a kickback. The last piece of the immediate puzzle was the physical trail she had foolishly left behind. I knew her house was ringed with surveillance cameras. She was, after all, a control freak, and while I couldn't access her footage, I could access my own. I pored over my exterior camera recordings from the night of the fire, running the footage frame by frame, looking for any vehicle, any shadow, any fleeting inconsistency. Nothing directly led to her, but the lack of anyone else was, in itself, damning. I also turned my professional scrutiny to the property records. I searched public databases for all properties owned by Rhonda Albright and her husband, noting any recent transactions, shell companies, or unexplained liens. She was the Queen of Beige, the HOA president, but the spreadsheets I was building suggested she might be living a life that was far less pristine than her public image suggested. My patience was absolute. Arthur Blackwood had told me to look for the loose thread, and every minute I spent in the data confirmed it. Rhonda had built her power on a shaky foundation, and I, the quiet forensic accountant up the hill, was about to pull the first thread. The methodical destruction of her reputation had officially left the planning stage. The pursuit of a digital ghost is a patient, tedious affair, but for a forensic accountant, it's a deeply satisfying one. Rhonda Albright had given me the loose thread, and now, immersed in the HOA's annual disclosures and quarterly reports, I was starting to feel the telltale tension that signals a whole tapestry is about to unravel. My focus was on the outflow of capital, specifically anything bearing her crisp, aggressive signature. What I found wasn't outright cartoonish theft, it was something far more insidious and endemic to her brand of petty tyranny, uncovering the foundation of fraud. The first red flag wasn't a huge sum, but a consistent, irritating pattern of small, inexplicable payments. The landscaping budget, under her tenure, had mysteriously ballooned by 40% in 2 years, yet the common areas looked exactly the same. Digging into the invoices, I saw a familiar vendor pop up, Green Acres Lawn and Patio Solutions. Their contracts were repeatedly renewed, always non-competitively, and always signed by Rhonda. I ran the business registration. The owner of Green Acres, her husband's cousin? A classic, textbook case of self-dealing, cloaked in the benign language of maintenance contracts. But the real insult to the community wasn't the expense, it was the revenue. I pivoted to the fine ledger, the arbitrary fines Rhonda loved to levy. They were her favorite tool for enforcing her aesthetics, her way of delivering a quick, punishing paper cut to anyone who dared to challenge her. I noticed that several neighbors, specifically those who had publicly clashed with her, had fines that were issued and then, mysteriously, never reported as paid on the public ledger. Instead, they were marked, resolved in cash, a small but profoundly damning detail. Where did that cash go? It didn't appear in the bank deposits. It was a clear, dark hole in the balance sheet, a place where Rhonda's petty cash operation was feeding her entitled lifestyle. One document, in particular, was a moment of vindication. It was an invoice for legal consultation on property rights and restrictions, billed to the HOA for $3,500. The date of the invoice? The week after I had presented my arborist report that disproved her claims about my tree. She had used HOA funds to pay a lawyer to try and find a way to silence or defeat me, the quiet guy up the hill, all because my tree was an eyesore. Rhonda's signature was on the approval line. Sharp and arrogant. She thought the HOA's money was her personal slush fund for waging suburban warfare. I had the proof. The pattern was clear. Inflated contracts for family, cash fines disappearing into the ether, and the blatant misuse of community funds for her personal vendetta against me. She had been funding her reign of terror with the very dues paid by the people she bullied. The tree was gone, but the data, the relentless, undeniable data, was now in my hands. The Chekhov's gun was loaded, and the ammunition was all those suspicious documents bearing her unmistakable, overconfident signature. She was about to find out that a petty tyrant's books are always their most vulnerable point. A true audit doesn't rely solely on the cold, hard numbers. It requires corroboration. The financial records provided the what, the foundation of fraud, but I needed the why and the how from the people who had endured Rhonda Albright's tyranny the longest. I needed to activate the quiet network, the silent majority of disgruntled neighbors who had suffered her arbitrary fines and petty dictates. These people weren't heroes. They were reluctant allies, wary of retribution, but bound by a shared, simmering grievance against the self-appointed Queen of Beige. My approach was as methodical and non-dramatic as my professional life. I didn't hold a neighborhood meeting or post on the community forum. I sought out individuals one by one, meeting them far from the prying eyes and surveillance cameras of Heritage Oaks, a quiet coffee shop miles away, or sometimes just a discreet conversation over a back fence. My initial target was old Mr. Henderson, the retired professor down the street whose solar panels Rhonda had fought tooth and nail. He was the wise, older figure, a man of quiet integrity who understood the long game. He was initially hesitant, his voice low and guarded. "Vance, she's vicious," he warned. "She goes after anyone who steps out of line. She's already tried to fine me 3 times this year over my gutter color." But when I presented him with the single-wire transfer slip detailing the exorbitant legal fee the HOA paid to fight his solar panels, a fee signed by quote, Rhonda, his reluctance turned to quiet fury. He gave me crucial, anecdotal evidence, a detailed 3-month timeline of her harassment, and a confirmation of the rumor that she handled some of the fine payments exclusively in cash. She called my panels a visual blight, and then she used my dues to pay a lawyer to attack me, he said, his voice laced with indignation. The entitlement was the injury, but the financial abuse was the insult. Next was the Johnson family, the ones who were forced to replace their blue mailbox. They were terrified of Rhonda, but the financial data I showed them, the strange payments to her husband's cousin's landscaping company, was the necessary tipping point. They confirmed that Rhonda had personally delivered their new approved beige mailbox and had insisted on a cash payment for the unforeseen administrative costs, another small, untraceable fine disappearing into the Rhonda Albright slush fund. The quiet network quickly solidified. They weren't seeking revenge, they were seeking vindication. They provided the texture, the names, the dates, and the crucial human element that confirmed my spreadsheets. The petty cash fines, the inflated contracts, the abuse of HOA funds for personal vendettas had all lined up. Rhonda had thought her power was absolute, but she had underestimated the resilience of the people she bullied and, more critically, the quiet determination of the forensic accountant who was now weaving their collective discontent into a single devastating narrative of corruption. The evidence was irrefutable. It was time to choose the battleground. My investigation had confirmed Rhonda Albright's financial corruption, but simple financial fraud, while damning, might only result in a quiet resignation, a polite, cushioned fall. That wasn't enough. She had used her petty authority, her beloved bylaws, to wage suburban warfare against me and the quiet network. Therefore, her undoing had to come from the very framework she thought protected her, the bylaw blueprint. The weapon of choice against the Queen of Beige had to be the precise, elegant application of her own rules. I treated the HOA governing documents, the covenants, conditions, and restrictions, or CC&Rs, like a complex piece of legal code in need of an audit. They were over 50 pages of dense, mind-numbing text, but for an analytical mind, they were a roadmap to her vulnerabilities. Rhonda and her cronies saw the bylaws as a club to wield. I saw them as a faulty dam waiting for the right pressure point. My goal was to find the forgotten clauses and the procedural loopholes that she had either ignored or actively exploited, and turn them into the legal framework for her final defeat. The first crucial discovery was a clause buried deep in Article 5, Section 3, detailing the process for board member removal. It required a special membership meeting, which could be called by a petition signed by not less than 15% of dues-paying members. Rhonda had certainly ignored this, assuming the members were too fearful and fragmented to ever organize. But thanks to the quiet network, I already had the signatures, patiently collected over 3 weeks of discreet, off-site meetings. That was the procedural lever. The second discovery was even more satisfying, a piece of glorious irony. I found a clause, established in 1983 and never repealed, that required all contracts exceeding $5,000 to be subject to a competitive bidding process and approval by a 2/3 majority of the entire membership, not just the board. Her sweetheart deals with her husband's cousin's landscaping company, they all exceeded that threshold. She had signed those contracts herself, bypassing the competitive bidding process and the full membership vote, a clear, irrefutable violation of fiduciary duty, meticulously documented and signed by her own hand. Rhonda had based her entire reign on the principle of control, believing the rules were only for everyone else. She thought the quiet guy up the hill was too timid or too ignorant to read the fine print. She was wrong. The financial fraud was the motive, but the bylaw blueprint was the perfect, irrefutable legal trap. My response was not going to be an accusation. It was going to be a motion, a flawlessly executed procedural maneuver delivered with the quiet authority she so desperately lacked. The counteroffensive was ready. The foundation of Rhonda Albright's petty tyranny wasn't built on large, dramatic pronouncements. It was built on the small, constant drip of arbitrary fines. These were her paper cuts, used not for revenue, but for control. The first domino I chose to push was a seemingly minor fine she had levied against me 3 months prior, a $75 penalty for unapproved lawn edging height. It was a ridiculous, subjective complaint, perfectly illustrative of her entitled overreach. This wasn't about the money. It was about exposing her system and establishing a legal precedent. I approached the challenge with the same methodical precision I would use to dismantle a corporate tax shelter. My communication was not a shouted complaint. It was a formal 5-page letter of appeal delivered via certified mail, of course. I cited not only my recently discovered clause from the bylaw blueprint regarding the appeals process, but also 3 separate, previous board rulings where similar complaints about lawn edging had been dismissed due to lack of objective measurement standards. I wasn't just refuting the fine. I was using her own history and her own rules as a weapon against her. My argument was simple, factual, and damning. I demanded, in writing, that the board provide the objective standard for approved lawn edging height, citing the clause that required all enforcement rules to be quantifiable and non-subjective. If the rule couldn't be quantified, it couldn't be enforced. It was a classic forensic accountant maneuver, demanding proof where none existed. The response from Rhonda, delivered via a thinly veiled email from the HOA secretary, was predictable. It was dismissive, condescending, and, crucially, emotional. She didn't address my legal points. She simply reiterated that the fine was valid and threatened to increase it for continued obstinance. She mistook my calm, factual letter for weakness and doubled down on her overconfident entitlement. She sent a quote, presented with a condescending tone, "Mr. Vance needs to realize that the rules are here to protect our community standards, not to be debated by amateurs." That quote, that arrogant dismissal, was the crucial error. Her refusal to comply with the bylaw's demand for due process was the first chink in her armor. It allowed me to escalate the matter. I promptly filed a formal grievance with the county mediator's office, citing her refusal to follow the HOA's own documented appeals procedure and attaching the evidence of her non-compliance. I had turned a $75 fine into a formal legal complaint about her gross procedural negligence and abuse of authority. The fine wasn't overturned yet, but the first domino was down. She was now formally on record with an outside authority for violating the procedural bylaw blueprint. The quiet guy up the hill was showing the petty tyrant how a professional uses the system. This was just the beginning of the 1,000 paper cuts. The first domino had fallen, yet the board Rhonda's inner circle had barely flinched. Having meticulously documented the financial fraud and the procedural violations detailed in the bylaw blueprint, I scheduled a meeting to present my findings. I walked into the grim fluorescent-lit HOA conference room, not with threats, but with binders full of cold, hard evidence. I was calm, factual, and ready to apply the crushing weight of the truth. What I encountered was the collective, entitled apathy of the board's blind eye. I laid out the audit, page by page, the egregious self-dealing with Greenacre's lawn and patio solutions, the disappearance of cash fines into an unknown abyss, and the blatant misuse of $3,500 of community funds to fight a private vendetta against my oak tree. My delivery was that of a forensic accountant delivering a terminal diagnosis to a corrupt client, quiet, authoritative, and irrefutable. I finished, placing the final spreadsheet on the table, and waited for the righteous indignation to take hold. Instead, I was met with a wall of dismissive attitudes and ingrained loyalty. Mr. Thompson, the vice president and a man clearly terrified of his own shadow, cleared his throat. Mr. Vance, he mumbled, refusing to meet my eyes. We appreciate your thoroughness, but Rhonda assures us these are just minor administrative oversights. We've been happy with Greenacre's work. He had dismissed a clear violation of fiduciary duty as a clerical error. He chose complacency over justice, fear over integrity. Then came Mrs. Chen, the treasurer, who was clearly a reluctant ally but paralyzed by Rhonda's influence. She offered a look of weary sympathy but said, "Rhonda has been the rock of this community for years. People trust her. And frankly, chasing after old invoices and petty cash fines is divisive. We need to move forward." They weren't denying the data, they were choosing to ignore it out of cowardice and the sheer inertia of letting the bully remain in charge. They were making a conscious choice to be an accomplice to the foundation of fraud. The truth was stark. Rhonda Albright didn't just rule the HOA, she was the HOA. Her control was so total, her persona as the entitled bully so terrifying, that the very people sworn to uphold the bylaws were actively choosing to be blind. She had successfully created an internal system where her word trumped any evidence, any rule, or any moral obligation. It was a disheartening, but crucial, realization. My enemy was not just Rhonda. It was the entire corrupt structure she had built. The Chekhov's gun of my evidence was useless if the target was shielded by a complicit bureaucracy. My strategy had to pivot. The quiet guy up the hill realized that the internal audit was over. It was time to find an external solution, a higher authority that didn't fear the Queen of Beige. The realization that the HOA board was a complicit, blind eye to Rhonda's corruption was not a defeat. It was merely a change in tactics. My internal audit had failed, not because the evidence was weak, but because the target was shielded by ingrained loyalty and fear. My strategy had to pivot from internal persuasion to external force. The Queen of Beige was about to discover that the world of a forensic accountant extends far beyond her petty subdivision boundaries. It was time for escalation. I wasn't going to waste time with neighborhood gossip or shouting matches. I bypassed the terrified vice president and the complicit treasurer entirely. My next move was methodical. A simultaneous, multi-pronged attack on the bureaucratic front. My evidence, the binders containing the bylaw blueprint violations, the damning spreadsheets detailing the self-dealing, and the undeniable paper trail of the disappearing cash fines was packaged and delivered to 3 distinct external bodies. First, the county regulator's office, the agency responsible for monitoring nonprofit organizations. My complaint was purely financial and legal. A formal, detailed report on the violation of fiduciary duty and the unapproved high-dollar contracts. I didn't mention the burned tree. I focused on the cold, hard numbers. I wanted them to see Rhonda not as an annoying HOA president, but as a potential case of embezzlement. The bureaucratic hurdle here was the sheer volume of paperwork, but my meticulous documentation, complete with highlighted passages and signed affidavits from the Quiet Network, made the evidence impossible to ignore. Second, the State Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division. This complaint focused on the arbitrary fines and the abuse of authority. I used the case of my own $75 fine, the first domino, as the perfect illustration of her procedural negligence and her refusal to comply with the HOA's own appeal rules. I included a direct quote from the HOA secretary, essentially an admission that they refused to engage in due process. It was the perfect narrative, the calm, factual citizen being victimized by the emotional, entitled tyrant. I knew this was the slow game. Bureaucracy moves at a glacial pace, and the threat of a state investigation is a far cry from an actual indictment. But the goal wasn't a quick arrest, it was leverage. Rhonda had thought she could use her petty authority as an impenetrable shield. I was showing her that the quiet guy up the hill could summon a convoy of black sedans from the state capitol, metaphorically speaking, simply by submitting a few well-documented certified letters. The game was no longer being played on her turf. The waiting began, but the pressure was building. Escalation was only the prelude. Rhonda Albright, the entitled bully, understood fire and screaming matches. She did not understand the quiet, relentless, soul-crushing force of bureaucracy weaponized by a professional. She thought she was safe behind her perimeter of beige envelopes and petty rules. I was about to unleash the paper blizzard, a controlled, relentless, almost invisible assault designed to inflict 1,000 paper cuts on her authority until she bled out administratively. The process was meticulously, almost boringly, professional. Based on the documentation I had sent to the external regulatory bodies, I initiated a constant, steady stream of official information requests, all perfectly legal, all citing the same obscure clause in the bylaws I had found in the bylaw blueprint that required full and immediate access to all financial and administrative documents by any dues-paying member. Every week, a new request arrived. Detailed breakdowns of the Green Acres invoices, the physical location of the cash fine ledgers, proof of competitive bidding for the $3,500 legal consultation, and so on. Each request was a single piece of paper, a single email, small, easy to dismiss on its own. But the volume was the weapon. She was receiving 10 to 15 of these per week, all stamped with an official, legal-sounding urgency, all requiring a formal, documented response within a limited time frame. Her entitlement allowed her to ignore a single letter. It could not allow her to ignore a dozen perfectly legal, professionally written inquiries that all hinted at the foundation of fraud I had uncovered. The effect was exactly as Arthur Blackwood had predicted. Rhonda and her terrified board were forced to spend their time frantically running in circles, chasing down old receipts, and composing defensive, legally vetted responses to things they thought were safely buried. They were using community time and community funds to fend off the quiet guy up the hill. A glorious irony. I wasn't shouting, I was simply demanding compliance. The dry humor of the situation was exquisite. Rhonda, who thrived on being the prosecutor, was suddenly the perpetually hounded defendant, having to justify every tiny fraudulent decision she had ever made. The paper blizzard was eroding her time, her energy, and her supreme, overconfident control. The system was now working against her, and she had no one to blame but herself. She had used paper to oppress. I was using paper to dismantle. She thought the fire had ended the conflict. She was about to find out that a true forensic accountant doesn't seek a quick win. They seek a total, systematic neutralization of the target's entire existence. The true weakness of an amateur tyrant is their greed. Rhonda Albright thought her paper blizzard problem was a matter of annoyance, 1,000 paper cuts she could endure until the quiet guy up the hill gave up. What she didn't realize was that every piece of paper I sent was another layer of cover I was forcing her to peel back, revealing the digital ghost of the one thing she truly protected, the money trail. My work as a forensic accountant allowed me to treat the HOA's accounts not as community funds, but as a criminal enterprise under audit. I had already identified the self-dealing with Green Acres Lawn and Patio Solutions, the company owned by her husband's cousin. But that was just the appetizer. Now, I was tracing the suspicious transactions, the faint digital breadcrumbs that led straight from the HOA coffers into pockets that smelled distinctly of Rhonda's expensive perfume. I drilled down into the miscellaneous expenses and administrative fees that Rhonda had casually signed off on. She had used these broad, generic categories to mask a clear pattern of embezzlement and self-enrichment. One series of recurring charges immediately caught my eye: monthly payments to an entity named Arbor Preservation Consulting. I remembered the name immediately. This was the firm she had initially hired, years ago, which produced a report conveniently stating my oak tree needed aggressive pruning that she had used as her first attempt to declare it an eyesore. I cross-referenced the registration for Arbor Preservation Consulting with public records. The sole proprietor? Rhonda Albright's best friend from high school, a woman who, according to her social media profile, primarily sold custom-made jewelry, not tree consultations. The monthly payments were for $800, a tidy, consistent sum that bled the community dry. The money wasn't for tree preservation. It was for a steady, untraceable stream of income for her closest ally, an abuse of funds disguised as consultation. This wasn't just small-time fraud. It was systemic corruption rooted in her supreme, overconfident belief that her authority was absolute. The missing cash fines were one thing, petty theft, but the padded, continuous contracts for her family's cousin and her best friend proved a deeper, more malicious intent. She had weaponized the HOA's budget, turning member dues into a personal patronage system to reward her inner circle. The single wire transfer slip I needed wasn't a smoking gun for the fire was just the motive. The real smoking gun was the undeniable paper trail proving she was systematically stealing from the very community she pretended to lead. I had the facts, the motive, and the undeniable documentation. The methodical planning phase was now transitioning to the inevitable, final conclusion. The digital ghost had been found, and it was signed, sealed, and delivered by Rhonda Albright herself. The meticulous dissection of Rhonda Albright's fraudulent finances had revealed her motive, the foundation of fraud she used to protect her petty fiefdom. But motive is only one piece of the puzzle. Her ultimate downfall had to include the initial, shocking act, the destruction of my ancient oak tree. I had the digital ghost of her corruption. Now, I needed the physical proof of her malice. This came in the form of a call from the local fire department's lead arson investigator, a man named Sergeant Miller. Miller was a tired, wise figure with the look of someone who had seen too much small-town nastiness. He hadn't been swayed by the official report's initial shrug about likely vagrancy, the small sample of melted plastic I had collected at the scene. The same fragments that were utterly inconsistent with a natural accident had been the necessary trigger. My suspicions, which had hardened into cold, calculated resolve, were about to be validated by the cold, impartial voice of law enforcement. He came to my quiet house on the hill not in uniform but in a plain, unmarked sedan, no flashing red and blue lights painting stripes yet, just the quiet authority of an official inquiry. I laid out the two sides of the story for him: the public war over the tree, the barrage of condescending, arrogant letters from the entitled HOA president, and the eventual, targeted incineration of the tree's base. He simply listened, a slow, methodical nod confirming he had heard this narrative before the petty bully pushed too far. Then he delivered the official verdict, a quiet, factual statement that turned my personal grievance into a criminal investigation. "We found traces of a commercial-grade accelerant, Mr. Vance," he said, holding up a small sealed evidence bag. "It was applied directly to the root crown and shielded from the street. It was a deliberate act, executed with forethought. The fire was not vagrancy. It was arson." That single word arson changed everything. Rhonda had thought the fire was the end of her problem, the ultimate display of her overconfident entitlement. She had successfully escalated a petty neighborhood dispute into a felony, believing her HOA title would shield her. She had been operating on the assumption that the fire would be a dead end. She didn't realize that the quiet guy up the hill was a forensic accountant who had just spent 3 months meticulously gathering every single piece of evidence about her financial crimes. The official report from Sergeant Miller was the critical piece of evidence, the final link between her motive, the removal of the eyesore tree, and her method, criminal malice. She had tried to intimidate a neighbor. She had instead handed me the legal leverage necessary to initiate her total destruction. She was no longer just the focus of an HOA audit. She was the primary suspect in a felony arson case, and I had the documentation to prove she was also a thief. The final, dramatic conclusion was now inevitable. Motive, method, and opportunity were now all meticulously confirmed. The arson investigator had given me the crime, and my forensic accounting had given me the criminal's financial blueprint. But I knew that relying solely on the slow grind of the state bureaucracy would grant Rhonda Albright, the entitled bully, too much time to build a defense, to use her community influence to spin the narrative. She had underestimated the quiet guy up the hill. It was time to deploy the ultimate piece of leverage, the court of public opinion. It was time for the press leak. This was not a job for a scattergun approach. I needed an outlet that specialized in investigative journalism, someone who understood the intoxicating mix of suburban petty tyranny and financial malfeasance. I chose a local investigative reporter at a regional paper, known for their righteous indignation and relentless pursuit of bureaucratic corruption. My contact was made not with a phone call or an email too traceable, too emotional, but with an anonymous, professionally prepared package delivered by courier. It was the epitome of a calculated disclosure. The package didn't contain every single document. It contained a narrative, meticulously crafted. It led with the most shocking, dramatic fact. HOA president suspected of arson in feud with neighbor. This was the hook. It immediately followed with the exquisite irony, the revelation that the president, Rhonda Albright, had used thousands of dollars in community dues tax-exempt funds to pay her best friend and her cousin's business in a clear case of self-dealing and foundation of fraud. I included copies of the most damning documents, the $3,500 legal bill to fight the quiet guy up the hill, and the single wire transfer slip to Arbor Preservation Consulting, juxtaposed against a public record showing the recipient had zero professional credentials. I framed the entire conflict not as a neighborhood dispute, but as a case of an overconfident dictator stealing from her subjects and then resorting to felony arson when challenged by a citizen who dared to read the rules. The entire narrative was a clear example of the calm protagonist versus the emotional antagonist, ready-made for media consumption. The strategic timing was everything. I coordinated the delivery of the package to coincide precisely with the regulatory bodies officially opening their files on the HOA, ensuring that when the paper called Rhonda for comment, she would already be scrambling to deal with the state attorney general. The result was exactly what I intended, an immediate, explosive front-page story. Rhonda had spent years cultivating the public image of the immaculate, professional community leader. With a single, quiet, professional act, the forensic accountant up the hill had reduced that perfect facade to ashes, revealing the entitled bully and the thief underneath. Public opinion was now turning, and the resulting chaos was the necessary pressure cooker for the final, inevitable confrontation. The calculated drip of my press leak did not result in a slow burn. It resulted in a bonfire. The next morning, Rhonda Albright's perfectly manicured world exploded into a media firestorm. The local investigative reporter, bless his righteous indignation, didn't just run a story. He ran a feature complete with an enormous, heartbreaking photo of the charred stump of my ancient oak, contrasting it with a perfectly framed shot of Rhonda's sterile, beige house. The headline was a masterpiece of ironic understatement. HOA president accused of arson and embezzlement in suburban warfare against neighbor. Local news segments descended on Heritage Oaks like a convoy of black sedans. They interviewed Mr. Henderson, the wise, older figure, whose calm recounting of Rhonda's arbitrary fines gave the story its human texture. They interviewed the terrified Johnsons, who, bolstered by the sight of the cameras, finally recounted the arrogance of the cash fine demands. The narrative was perfect. The entitled bully, the self-serving tyrant, finally exposed by the quiet guy up the hill. Online forums and social media exploded with outrage. The story went viral, migrating from the local news to national aggregator sites, instantly becoming an archetypal tale of righteous revenge against unchecked petty authority. People commented not just on the arson, but on the sheer audacity of the financial fraud, the foundation of fraud she had built on the backs of her neighbors. Rhonda, the woman who craved control above all else, was suddenly the subject of 1,000 mocking memes and a relentless torrent of public scrutiny. Her name was now synonymous with overconfident entitlement and the abuse of power. She was unaccustomed to true public scrutiny, thriving only in the controlled fluorescent-lit environment of the HOA meeting room. The pressure caused her to visibly and dramatically unravel. The newscasters caught her outside her home, frantic, trying to shield her face from the cameras while incoherently shouting about defamation and unapproved media coverage. Her polished facade cracked and shattered, replaced by the raw, ugly face of a bully who had finally lost control. She was no longer the queen of beige. She was the neighborhood villain, caught in the headlights. As for me, the forensic accountant who had simply done his job, I was suddenly, ironically, positioned as a local hero, the calm protagonist who had patiently defeated the emotional tyrant using nothing but data and the bylaw blueprint. I avoided the cameras, letting the evidence, the cold, hard numbers speak for themselves. The paper blizzard had yielded to a true firestorm, and Rhonda Albright was caught directly in the eye of the storm. Her petty, fraudulent reign was over. The final dramatic conclusion was upon her. The deafening roar of the media firestorm was the shockwave that finally fractured the stubborn inertia of the board. They had been content to be the blind eye, shielding Rhonda Albright from the quiet guy up the hill with their collective apathy and fear. But when the state attorney general's office, the county regulator, and every local news camera simultaneously descended on Heritage Oaks, their ingrained loyalty evaporated, replaced by the acute, paralyzing dread of personal legal liability. The pressure was irresistible. Rhonda, the erstwhile queen of beige, was locked down in her house, frantically consulting lawyers and issuing incoherent, frantic statements. The other board members, Mr. Thompson, the terrified vice president, and Mrs. Chen, the reluctant treasurer, suddenly realized that their names were on the same corporate documents as the now infamous foundation of fraud. They recognized the gravity of their position. They were not just a voluntary neighborhood council. They were, legally, complicit in her violation of fiduciary duty. The structure she had built had turned into a collapsing scaffold, and they were scrambling to get off before the total, dramatic conclusion. Their retreat was immediate and predictably self-serving. They didn't call me. They called an emergency closed-door meeting at an off-site location, desperate to project an image of decisive action. The result was a sterile public press release, delivered by a newly hired high-priced corporate lawyer, a clear signal that the amateurs were out and the professionals were in. The language was meticulously clinical, designed to distance the board from the tyrant they had so recently protected. The key line, the most satisfying piece of bureaucratic doublespeak, was the one that officially threw Rhonda to the wolves. The board has initiated an internal forensic audit and disciplinary review concerning the alleged activities of the current president, and she has been placed on immediate, temporary administrative leave pending the outcome. Administrative leave. The utter irony of the term was exquisite. The woman who had obsessed over every blade of grass, who had used her title to inflict 1,000 paper cuts on the community, was being suspended for her own corruption. They had no choice. The bylaw blueprint I had weaponized, combined with the irrefutable evidence of the money trail, was a professional indictment. The board's retreat was the final confirmation of my strategy. You cannot withstand the truth when it is delivered with professional precision and backed by external authority. Rhonda's inner circle had crumbled. The calm protagonist had succeeded in isolating the emotional antagonist, clearing the stage for the final act of righteous justice. The next step would be the formal, public removal, the necessary final act of vindication. The board's retreat had been the board's public admission of guilt. The next morning brought the final, dramatic conclusion. The chaos that Rhonda Albright had unleashed with her entitled, malicious act of arson was now returning to her doorstep with quiet, overwhelming force. I was having my first cup of coffee, a peaceful, victorious silence filling the house on the hill, when the first black sedan turned onto the cul-de-sac. It wasn't a subtle process. Sergeant Miller, the arson investigator, wasn't interested in a discreet conversation. He arrived with 2 uniformed police officers and a detective from the county prosecutor's office, the very embodiment of the legal hammer. The street, usually a haven of sterile, beige quiet, was instantly saturated with the pulsing, visceral reality of law enforcement. The flashing red and blue lights painting stripes across Rhonda's immaculate, overconfident home were the final, irrefutable visual cue of her total loss of control. It was glorious, cinematic justice. The charges were the result of the seamless collaboration between my forensic accounting and the arson investigator's evidence. Rhonda Albright, the self-appointed queen of Heritage Oaks, was formally arrested and charged not just with a single crime, but with a perfect trifecta of her malice and greed. Arson for the deliberate burning of my ancient oak, embezzlement for the systematic looting of the HOA's funds through self-dealing and the money trail, and violation of fiduciary duty for her entire reign of financially motivated terror. I watched from my upstairs window, the quiet guy up the hill, providing an intimate look into the downfall of an emotional tyrant. Rhonda's facade had completely dissolved. She was shouting, tears streaming down her face, still clinging to the threadbare remnants of her entitlement. "You can't do this to me! I'm the president!" She shrieked, her voice cracking with indignation. It was the ultimate irony. She thought her petty title was an impenetrable shield, and she couldn't comprehend that the law viewed her simply as a felon. My emotional state was not one of wild celebration. It was a profound, surreal satisfaction. I remained calm, professional, and observant, noting the precise time she was placed into the back of the sedan. This wasn't about vengeance. It was about vindication. She had met the quiet, methodical fury of an auditor, and she had lost everything. The calm protagonist had ensured that the emotional antagonist was finally held accountable, not through a shouting match, but through the patient, relentless application of evidence and the law. Her reign was over. The structure she had built had been systematically dismantled. The lesson was clear. Don't confuse quiet authority with weakness. The dramatic conclusion of the legal hammer, the sight of Rhonda Albright being led away in cuffs, still shouting about her entitlement, was not the end of the process. It was merely the inflection point. Justice, especially the kind delivered by the state, is not fast. It is exhaustive. The criminal charges were one track, but the civil and administrative consequences were the true final act that cemented her total destruction. The foreclosure and the Phoenix was the financial and symbolic retribution for her foundation of fraud and her malicious act of arson. The moment the board's retreat became public, the community moved swiftly to seek restitution. The HOA, now under professional temporary management, filed a massive civil suit against Rhonda to recover the funds, the years of inflated payments to her family's cousin, the unaccounted-for cash fines, and the thousands of dollars in legal fees she used to wage her personal suburban warfare. When the inevitable judgments came down, they were staggering. Rhonda's assets, already strained by high-priced legal fees, were instantly seized. She couldn't pay. The ultimate consequence for the Queen of Beige, the woman obsessed with property values and appearances, was the forced sale of her most prized possession. I watched the legal notices with the same methodical focus I used to find the money trail. The public auction sign that eventually went up on her perfectly manicured lawn, listing her overconfident home for foreclosure, was the final, satisfying piece of irony. The woman who called my ancient oak an eyesore was now having her own property declared a financial ruin. The metaphorical bulldozers of justice were tearing up her foundation. But the real satisfaction, the true climax of my righteous revenge, was the renewal. With Rhonda gone, The quiet network emerged from the shadows, now a supportive, vocal community. They didn't offer me praise. They offered the dignity of genuine appreciation. Old Mr. Henderson and I, along with a few others, stood on the newly cleared corner where the charred stump of my family heirloom once stood. We weren't there to mourn, but to begin again. I had commissioned a specialized nursery to cultivate a new live oak, a descendant of the very tree Rhonda had tried to erase. It was a young sapling, barely 6 feet tall, but it was sturdy. Planting it, burying its roots in the same soil, was a profound, quiet moment of triumph. Rhonda Albright had used fire and entitlement to try and win a petty battle. I had used patience and professional expertise to win the war, and the reward was not just her downfall, but the rebirth of my property and the entire community. The new oak, the phoenix, was a permanent, quiet monument to the fact that arrogance will always crumble under the weight of meticulous truth. The quiet, methodical planting of the new oak, the phoenix, was more than just a symbolic act on my property. It was the signal for the rebirth of the entire community. With the legal hammer having removed Rhonda Albright and her foundation of fraud from the premises, the HOA entered a phase of necessary, painful restructuring, the aftermath, rebuilding the community. The system she had corrupted couldn't simply be patched. It had to be dismantled and rebuilt with integrity. The old board's retreat had cleared the air, but the remaining members were quickly removed by a mandate from the newly engaged community. An emergency election was called, and the quiet network, once a collection of terrified, reluctant allies, transformed into a powerful, unified voting bloc. The new leadership was composed not of career bureaucrats or entitled social climbers, but of ordinary, honest neighbors. Mr. Henderson, the wise older professor, was reluctantly but universally elected as the new president. His first action, delivered with his characteristic quiet authority, was to implement a fully transparent, professionally audited financial system, ensuring that every dollar spent was documented and publicly accessible. No more cash fines, no more self-dealing. I found myself an unexpected voice in this reform. I declined any formal title. The quiet guy up the hill prefers to be the power behind the curtain, but my expertise as a forensic accountant was now deployed for good. I helped draft the new financial oversight clauses, making the bylaw blueprint airtight and resistant to future petty tyrants. My goal was not to rule, but to create a system that was so clean, so auditable, that no future Rhonda could ever weaponize it against her neighbors again. The biggest change, however, was the palpable shift in the community's emotional tone. The pervasive, low-level dread of Rhonda's entitlement, the fear of the next beige envelope, had lifted. Neighbors started talking openly again, their fear replaced by a shared sense of vindication and a genuine desire to heal. They understood finally that the silence and apathy had been the true enabler of the bully. My victory wasn't just my own, it was the community's triumph over the suffocating arrogance of the few. The irony was perfect. Rhonda, in her desperate attempt to assert her total control, had inadvertently forced her neighbors to unite, creating a stronger, fairer community in her absence. The quiet satisfaction was absolute. The war was over, and the patient application of professional method had won. I get a lot of questions about how I did it, how the quiet guy up the hill brought down the Queen of Beige. People assume there was a moment of rage, some dramatic confrontation that led to the legal hammer. But the real lesson learned, the true vindication, is that there was no such moment. My victory had nothing to do with emotion, and everything to do with methodical planning and an unwavering resolve. The entire ordeal was a profound experiment in the nature of power. Rhonda Albright believed power was a loud, visible thing. It was her title, her immaculate lawn, her condescending, arrogant letters, and finally, the deliberate fire she started. She used aggression and entitlement as her tools, and she was so overconfident in them that she never once considered that someone might be playing a different game. She thought she was fighting a neighbor in a grudge match. She was actually being audited by a professional who saw her petty tyranny as a complex financial crime. I had been told by Arthur Blackwood, the wise older figure, to seek not revenge but discrepancy, and that's what I did. I didn't shout, I simply opened the books. I didn't get emotional, I simply followed the money trail. I didn't threaten, I simply used the bylaw blueprint to file a professional, legal motion. My greatest strength wasn't my anger, it was my patience. My greatest weapon wasn't my voice, it was my ability to quietly and meticulously assemble the evidence. The paper blizzard wasn't an act of revenge, it was an act of professional due diligence. Rhonda's complete and utter meltdown, her public humiliation in the media firestorm, and her frantic shouts of, "You can't do this to me," as she was arrested, were not the result of a single devastating blow. They were the inevitable consequence of 1,000 small, precise cuts. The calm protagonist did not defeat the emotional antagonist with a punch. He defeated her with a spreadsheet, a deed restriction, and an official complaint. The forensic accountant showed her that the small, quiet details she ignored were the very things that would bring her entire world to a spectacular public end. The new oak, the phoenix, now stands as a permanent, living monument to this lesson. True power lies not in aggression, but in strategic intelligence and unwavering resolve. The story of my war with Rhonda Albright didn't end with her arrest or her public humiliation. It ended with the quiet act of standing on a patch of freshly tilled soil, a single young sapling in my hands. The ground was still scarred with the memory of the fire, but it was also new, ready for growth. Rhonda had used fire to make a statement of dominance. I was using a glimmer of green to make a quiet, permanent statement of resilience. This new live oak, my family's new sentinel, was a symbol of hope and of the enduring spirit of a community reclaiming its peace. Rhonda had seen the first oak as an eyesore, a thing to be destroyed. I saw this new one as a testament to the fact that something beautiful and powerful can rise from the ashes of entitlement and greed. This little sapling, barely 6 feet tall, represented the end of her tyranny and the beginning of a new chapter for the quiet neighborhood. The true triumph was not the victory itself, but the peace that followed. My neighbors, once strangers in a collection of beige houses, now had a shared history, a quiet solidarity forged in the fire of an overconfident bully's demise. The fear was gone. The paper blizzard had ceased, replaced by the tranquil hum of normal, uneventful life. My house on the hill was no longer a silent island in a sea of passive aggression. It was a beacon for the power of methodical planning and the quiet resolve of the calm protagonist. The journey had been long, the planning meticulous, and the retribution total, but the end result was a profound, quiet peace that Rhonda, in her desperate pursuit of control, could never have understood. She had wanted to silence my dissent, to erase my tree and me from her perfect, sterile world. She had failed. The quiet guy up the hill was quiet no more, but the peace he now enjoyed was deafening. It was a silence filled with the promise of a future where an honest man's quiet authority would always, in the end, defeat the loud, empty aggression of a bully.